And we're on.
Good morning and welcome to the House Environment and Energy Committee. This morning we are going to continue our conversation with S213. And I think where we should start is where we left off yesterday afternoon, which is discussing proposed language from Representative Sibilia for a report.
Get to it.
Yep.
Chair. I think it's posted on our website, is that right?
It is.
It's yesterday and it's listed under my name.
It is. And so yesterday was our walkthrough.
We walked
So would it
through
just
it.
be like to explain what I'm trying to achieve? here?
Yes.
Yes. So I think members have heard me ask the question about how do we know that we are not, I'm worried that with our policies that we could be unintentionally gentrifying rural Vermont and making it difficult for working people to stay there, live there, have their kids stay there. And folks with means will be able to come in and buy their way through the different permitting processes, a number of which I think, most of which I think are appropriate and prudent. And I understand why we have to pay for the people to staff those processes, and those things done. So I understand that whole system, but I am really worried about the unintentional effect of making rural Vermont only a place that people with means can live in. And so this, and it's really grateful to Michael for, because it feels like not trying to solve that whole question, but asking for input from ANR about what's possible here. When you think about Act 250 and wetlands fees, is there something that makes sense? Is there a way that you could try and devise for people with low income or other criteria? You've heard me talk about my neighbor in Connecticut, my neighbor who's lived on their land for 100 years, and just how do they experience, many of the really good regulations that we're putting forward that also include new barriers. So I think that in a nutshell is what I'm trying to achieve here. Have ANR come back to us just with that concept. Is there something we can do here to help folks, particularly when you think about folks who already live on the land? Like I think my next door neighbor, if their child wants to have a home on their land and we want them to develop in an area in a way that's responsible, it could be very expensive and it could be prohibitive, and their child may not be able to. And then someone else would, just because they have means. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Do members have questions or Representative Sibilia? Representative Sacre.
I guess I would just wonder about the scale. Like, if you're really looking to develop your property, you're talking about building a house, subdividing, doing other land improvements, those costs are large. And if we're looking at the cost of fees, it just seems like we're really looking at, with maybe some very unusual possible exceptions, that we're really looking at costs which are completely dwarfed and by those costs of development. And I just have a hard time wrapping my mind around how this will actually help those folks.
Well, that's what I would like to find out from ANR. Is there a means of making this so that it's reasonable for my kids, who are, they're just working people that live here, but $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in engineering and other costs could be a difference maker. And maybe there's nothing to be done about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my sense, I'm not an expert on the fees, but my sense is that those kinds of fees would be very unusual for, and that the kinds of fees that we're looking at in the amendment are much more encompassing than just those sorts of, larger fees that I think mostly would be up in terms of meeting, some criteria for Act 250.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So are you talking about, when you talk about a fee, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you?
So there are a number of different permit fees. One that I went through and worked on was a wetlands like offsetting. And I have never gone through that process myself, but pulled up the fee or the form for determining a fee and went through that process and came up with potentially a $5,000 fee.
So, but a mitigation fee or a permit application fee?
I think it was a mitigation fee.
Okay, so I don't know if this captures that. Does this capture that?
So I'm not really sure what Representative Sevilio did. It could have been mitigation. It could have just been the permit fee because the permit fee for wetlands is based on square footage. About the amount that is impacted and the fees can be high.
But that's, I guess that's what I mean, like, that's a mitigation fee, not an application.
Now, that is the application fee.
Is the mitigation fee?
No, it's the application fee serves a mitigation function,
I see, yeah.
right? Because if you are incented to mitigate and reduce, because otherwise your permit application fee is high.
Right, so that's in case, I mean, okay, so that's a scenario if I want to develop a wetland. Yeah,
Or a buffer.
buffer on a class.
Yeah, because the fee is different, but it's the same concept.
And so is the question whether or not the language is correct, whether or not it's too specific in saying permit as opposed to just generally fees, because it does say fees in the first.
Well, I kind of understand the chair's point because you raised the $30,000, $40,000 engineering cost. This does not address that. Because that is just part of, say, your wastewater treatment system / your septic system. You need a professional engineer or a professional tech to approve that. And that may require significant technical services depending on where you are in the state. And this doesn't address that.
That's a cost of doing,
That's a
that's a
cost of-
design cost.
Right.
I think maybe that's also what Representative Sakowicz was talking about. So then, and then you add the Act 215 here. The example that you keep bringing us back to shouldn't, in my mind, be triggering Act 250. And so then I get a little lost in what is the purpose of what we're doing. Because someone that's proposing a larger subdivision, like not one or two units or parcels for their kids, one or two parcels not going to trigger Act 250. Someone with a larger ambition presumably is capitalized and can pay for fees.
So I think we've contemplated policies here which would increase the jurisdiction of Act 250. And I think this policy that we have in front of us would also increase the state's jurisdiction over certain types of land in river corridors and also in wetlands. And I'm open to suggestions about how to better say to Vermonters, we're not trying to make this I'm even okay with burdensome because we are facing great challenges. But we want to recognize that not everyone comes that I felt like this language was broad enough and that it would provide the agency with an opportunity to just kind of come back on the concept.
Could I offer something? Yesterday, and this is my drafting error, you were talking about how it's waiver or reduction, and it only says reduction once. So I do think that that's a drafting error on my part. It should say waiver or reduction. But you could also have mitigation, waiver, reduction, or mitigation of fees. And mitigation is something that is incorporated into a couple of different A&R permits, like stormwater. You implement the stormwater management manual, and that mitigates your permit fee on site to a point where you can't do any more mitigation. And then you pay. And so I do think that there's potentially ways to include mitigation into some of these permit programs. It serves both the purpose of achieving some whatever conservation effort while also reducing the cost for a permit. So I think from a drafting perspective, I could have done a better job. And I'm saying, and that came up yesterday when I think it was Representative Smith asked about reduction.
Okay, thank you. Representative Stebbins.
Yeah, I guess, I'm seeing this within the context of, we just did a ton of work on H687. And we, had to shore up funding for the NRD, because of exemptions that we made last year. And I guess, I don't have a good enough sense of what we're actually talking about with this. Meaning, if someone is wanting to do a project where they have 1 or 2 units for their family and they wouldn't hit Act 250, I'm not sure that this could help. If someone is wanting to do something larger, there's part of me that feels like we just had, with all of S213 writ large, we have this ongoing balance of how do we make sure we are building in places that are not going to create further harm later. And I guess for me with this language, and maybe you could help with like how this might actually interplay, like what are we really talking about for Act 250 projects in terms of when is a low income person going to do a project that would hit a certain amount of money, and what could that project, do we have any examples from the past that I'm trying to get a sense of how this could help a low income person if, as it is, we wouldn't trigger fees via Act 250 for a 1 or 2 family site. That's what I'm I'm just struggling with because, I'm still thinking about the fact that the ADU language was passed via a floor amendment, and we don't know what that means. Maybe that means an ADU is built up on who knows where, and it washes downstream and wipes out another house. We don't know because we didn't take more testimony on it. So that's what I'm struggling with in terms of how this fits, given that we just worked on 687, and I don't quite understand how this fits within Act 250 at large. Like what types of projects, how much money?
I think that's what we would learn.
Frankly, it's left to the discretion of this report. It doesn't set limits on what kind of project, so it could be any Act 250 project that they could establish criteria. And it's not just for low income, it could be for other criteria as well. So there's no box put on the report with regard to Act 250 projects. It could be any project. You've partly addressed these types of projects through accessory on farm language. But in the past, it has come up that a farm would want to do a project. What they are proposing isn't technically farming. They are on a tract that's 10 acres or more, and they can't afford the Act 250 process, including the permit fees. And that has happened. But you addressed that, but I could see similar circumstances for non-farms.
Okay, actually, so the Agency of Natural Resources is in the room, and we've been talking about this report. Is it clear enough language for you all to report back with?
This is Hannah Smith with the Agency of Natural Resources. I think that there is a clear enough directive that we could work on this. I'm curious how, if there's more specifics regarding how the agency would work with the NRB on this, because it says, criteria to waive A&R or Act 250 fees. And since we don't administer Act 250, I think that we'd primarily be focusing on our fees, maybe as they relate to the Act 250 process, the permits that create rebuttable presumptions under Act 250. But if the committee's looking for more specifics around Act 250 fees, I guess I would just ask if that's
Hard to get
supposed to be part of this report.
You would ask what? I'm sorry.
Whether NRB should be
Yeah.
an active participant in developing the report.
I can bifurcate them. I can put sub A as A&R and sub B as NRB if you want.
Representative Sakowicz.
We've been asking A&R to do a lot, and I just wonder if I can ask them sort of how much effort you suspect would have to go into creating this report. And the burden would it be on the agency?
Yeah, I mean, like the chairwoman said the other day, we are asked to do a lot of studies pretty regularly, so program is not gonna love this because it will add additional responsibility, but something that we're used to having to comply with annually, so. It takes time, yes, it'll take time with the program, but again, if we get resources attached to this bill that we've asked for, I think we could do that.
You sort of answered my question.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying.
Ideal to do another study, but the legislature has us do studies on a pretty regular
I
basis.
guess I'm trying to get a sense of the scale of effort that would have to go into this. I just don't have a good sense of whether this is something that, someone does in an afternoon, or if this is something that a team of people takes a month, like.
It'll take time and like Hannah and I were saying yesterday, it would be unique to business as usual. We don't do income sensitive permitting fees like this in any other program, so this would be unique to the agency. So yeah, it would take several months probably to compile this and get the information. And if we're working in collaboration with the NRB, probably take a little bit more time.
Representative Bonhart.
Didn't say anything.
Oh, you raised, I thought you raised your hand.
No, just.
Okay. What does it look like if you separate the NRB from the A&R?
It's gonna look a little duplicative. It'll both say on or before January 15th. Sub A will say the secretary shall report to you with a report on how to establish criteria to waive A&R fee, waive or reduce A&R fees for persons of low income or other criteria. And then in sub B, it'll say the same thing for the NRB.
We had an NRB fee report as part of the last session work that didn't get a lot of attention, I think. Yeah, Deputy Secretary.
Just thinking too, in terms of conversations with Ways and Means, in terms of us submitting our fees to them earlier this year. This might be a conversation that could be a good conversation in the Ways and Means Committee as it pertains to fees. Just a suggestion if you're not leaning towards a study to come back.
It's actually an interesting point because this will send the bill to Ways and Means where it probably doesn't need to go to Ways and Means otherwise. It did not go to Finance in the Senate.
Does need to go to appropriations.
It went to appropriation.
I actually did have my hand up, I forgot.
Oh
I was
my
gonna ask.
God, that is
I
like
was gonna-
such
well,
mansplaining.
We got distracted by a different conversation. I was gonna just ask about the last clause about draft legislation. Is that common? That, yes, it is, okay. And okay, normally I think of it as being recommendations.
We just had that conversation on another topic of draft legislation for
We cut it.
geothermal, and we cut it. Yeah.
So it actually, it's a relatively new directive to take away the fact that the agency actually write a report. Because sometimes it says the report shall take the form of draft legislation. But this doesn't do that. I think you're gonna need some actual explanation in this report, so it doesn't just take the form of draft legislation. Part of this is because the A&R permit fee statute is literally a monster. And if you're gonna provide recommendations on how to reduce or mitigate, I'd like the agency to show how they would do that in draft legislation.
Representative Sebelia.
And so, Michael, as you've drafted this, the report could include a recommendation that the state should not establish these criteria.
That's correct. Yeah, it's not a, they have to, it's whether or not.
Also say that having draft legislation presumes it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about, this is what is part of this driven program. And then with the fees getting increased for the middle class, so whatever. So how do we?
Yeah, how do we make the difference up?
I mean, the concept of income sensitive fees is not new. In most jurisdictions, it falls to the local entity or a county entity. You don't have county government here. So it's not an unusual concept, but it's usually a more of a local or county or regional tool.
When you say it's not a new, I mean, where does that happen in Vermont?
It doesn't happen.
Oh, okay, so it would be unusual.
In other jurisdictions.
Well, what's the example you're thinking of?
I know Pennsylvania has income sensitive fees. I know Colorado does. I mean, there are multiple jurisdictions that have fee structures like that.
Or environmental permitting.
Or development.
Representative Simmons.
I was just gonna say that kind of gets to what Rep. Sakowitz was saying yesterday. About the bigger picture of the various areas in which there are financial constraints for lower income Vermonters. And I don't know, you said it better yesterday.
It does say low income or other criteria.
Which would be what?
It could be middle income.
Or high income?
But, based on, the agency that has oversight of what's happening with all these fees and, are there any that, we should be waiving? Or that we could contemplate waiving?
Okay, so I want to overthink the reporting, but I do want to address some of the things that we brought up. So what do you think about separation of the NRB piece of this?
I think that's fine. And I think also adding in the mitigation aspect would be important as well.
Did we do a study in 687 for ag?
What part of ag?
Well, like council brought up, we did address accessory on farm businesses in part. And then I think there's another study in there. Yeah.
I'm scheduled on another committee right now.
I know, we are
Should
scheduled for something else too.
reconcile those two.
Yeah, we should do that. Okay, when are you free again?
That depends, honestly. 'Cause I have a invitation to go into GovOps this afternoon. I am free. I'm in your committee at 2:00. So that's probably the next time I'd be available. You're on the floor at 1?
Yeah. All right, let's just count on getting back to this afternoon. Seth will follow up on what we've already asked for in reporting. We could have you in your spare time. Is it possible?
Yeah, I can rewrite it.
That would be great. And Representative Stebbins.
I'm not sure if this is a fair question since you weren't the primary drafter of 687, but just with the studies and the reports in there,
Seth's gonna follow up on.
okay.
Yeah, we'll try and reconcile that further. And if we get more information that changes what we've asked you to do, we'll get it to you as soon as possible, so you don't spend time on something we don't need. Anything further on this before we shift gears? And we need to look at the other changes that you've made.
Right.
We'll do that this afternoon.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael. Okay. We are moving into S-259, an act relating to climate change cost recovery. And since we changed the start time for this, I want to just check in with our witnesses and see if this order still works for all of you, including Andy Jones, who's joining us by Zoom.
Yes.
You're okay at being third still?
Yes.
Or, well, he's third on the one I'm looking at now.
Oh, I guess so. I'm, that's what I saw yesterday.
We're thinking, oh, well, what order do you guys want to go in?
I think it makes sense for Lauren to go last.
Okay. So we'll have Ben, Edgerly Walsh, oh, and I haven't, kick us off here.
My cue?
Is and I guess before we get started, one thing that we have been, we've been talking about climate change and costs of resiliency and recovery and mitigation to our communities. This bill kind of fits squarely into that. And I would say very, this whole biennium and previous biennia, we have been taking testimony on this topic. And so we've had a review of kind of the testimony that we did take. Then Edgerly Walsh headed up a look at the history of our testimony on this topic and has provided us documentation with links to that testimony. If members would like to refresh their memories on that, it will be submitted under his name on the record today. And it does help flesh out and frame the larger topics that we are talking about addressing with this bill.
Thank you. For the record, Ben Edgerly Walsh with the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. I guess just to very briefly start by addressing the document that Chair Sheldon just raised, I just want to be clear that was not intended to be a comprehensive look at everything that anyone has ever said in this committee about climate resilience or impacts, but rather sort of the most relevant testimony as you consider S-259. Though obviously some of that testimony also sort of strayed into other areas that are less relevant to this particular bill. So I wanted to set the stage by talking a little bit about why VPIRG supports S259, get into the structure of the bill at a very high level. I know you've already gotten your walkthrough from Ledge Council, so I'll make that brief. But that it could be helpful because there are obviously a number of moving pieces. I'll then get into the science behind both how the bill is doing what it's doing and the climate crisis and its impacts on Vermont specifically, and then on sort of the history of national and international climate action in terms of why the covered period in the bill is the appropriate covered period. And then I'll wrap with just a little bit on some potential language changes for you to consider. So historically sorry, let me back up. I don't think it's going to be a surprise anyone around this table to hear that VPIRG strongly supports S259 for the simple reason that the costs of climate change are already staggering, and we know they're only going to go up from here. And we believe that Vermonters should not have to shoulder those costs alone. The parties responsible for the climate crisis should be required to pay their fair share of the costs of Vermont to adapt to, become more resilient to, and respond to the climate crisis. You also know that historically in the climate space, VPIRG has primarily advocated for actions specifically targeted at reducing climate pollution. That is not what this bill is about. I just want to be very clear about that. It is about ensuring that Vermont has the resources necessary, in particular over the medium to long term, to deal with the effects of the climate crisis. There may be some sort of side effects of actions from this bill that will reduce pollution. Weatherization of homes is one great example that is both climate resilience and pollution reducing, in that it helps Vermonters be more resilient to heat waves that are coming at us, and will also reduce pollution in the heating sector. But that is not the goal of this bill. The largest fossil fuel companies in the world made over $200 billion in 2022 and again in 2023. Meanwhile, Vermonters have gotten stuck with the costs of climate change cleanup in our communities. That shouldn't be the case. These same fossil fuel companies knowingly made a mess of the climate. As you heard in detail in your joint hearing with House Judiciary, they knew about the dangers of carbon pollution decades ago, and they should be, in our view, required to help pay to address the costs of the climate crisis to Vermont. This polluters pay principle is well established in state and federal law, as you also heard a bit about last week, and has repeatedly been upheld in our nation's courts. So in our view, the key question is, who do we think should pay the costs caused by the climate crisis? And in our view, the answer is clear. Vermont should do everything it can to ensure that the world's largest fossil fuel companies pay their fair share, rather than sitting back and accepting as our fate that Vermont and Vermonters should have to shoulder this burden largely on our own. Now I want to talk a little bit about the structure of S259 and sort of the actions that it would set in motion were it to be enacted into law. First, the Agency of Natural Resources, in collaboration with the Treasurer's Office, would have to adopt a resilience implementation strategy. As you heard, that's basically a plan, a strategy that looks at prioritizing climate resilience and adaptation investments. Second, the state treasurer would issue a report on the cost of Vermont of covered greenhouse gas emissions. That would be informed by the climate resilience strategy, but that would just be one component of it. It would have to build from there. Next, ANR would have to adopt rules on a number of topics, including adopting methodologies to identify responsible parties, determining proportional liability amongst the parties, and how to issue notices of cost recovery demands. They'd obviously then issue those cost recovery demands to responsible parties. Payments would be due 6 months. First payments would be due 6 months after that. Those funds would be deposited in the fund created by this bill, and those funds would be used as laid out in the bill, generally speaking, for climate change adaptation projects, in particular in the resilience implementation strategy and Vermont Emergency Management State Hazard Mitigation Plan, which already exists, and along with reasonable administrative expenses. So in terms of the investments that are actually allowed under the bill. The definition, which I'll read just briefly in part here, of climate change adaptation projects is a project designed to respond to, avoid, moderate, repair, or adapt to negative impacts caused by climate change and to assist human and natural communities, households, and businesses in preparing for future climate change-driven disruptions. And then, obviously, as you've seen, the bill also includes a non-exhaustive list of eligible projects. So as you can see, the definition is sort of very broad. It's essentially any rational action the state can take in the face of the climate crisis to reduce or respond to or prepare for the negative effects of the climate crisis. And then ultimately, these investments would be guided by the resilience implementation strategy that ANR is tasked with coming up with under the bill. Last couple of things on the sort of structure of the bill and how it works. The treasurer's cost estimate is really central to the bill. That's the big number that the liability would be sort of determined out of. And that broadly falls into two categories. One is costs that have been incurred or projected to be incurred in the future within the state of Vermont from the emissions during the covered period. So you could sort of think about that as the cost of the damage that the climate crisis is going to cause to Vermont. Again, particularly the emissions covered by the bill. And then the second is more the sort of adaptation and resilience investments that that would be made or could be made in Vermont to reduce those or respond to those effects. So costs from damages, costs from investments and activities. Coming out of that, there'll be the big number. It'll be categorized, broken up into its component pieces as well. But from that big number of all of these costs from the emissions in the covered period, you have the proportional liability determined. And I, in my written testimony, have that sort of laid out in a formula. But basically, it's the percentage a given responsible party represents of the total emissions from fossil fuels during that covered period, that 30-year period. So if a company is 1% of all the global emissions from fossil fuels during that period, they would be delivered a cost recovery demand of 1% of the total cost the treasurer estimates Vermont has incurred and will incur. So I want to talk, as I said, a little bit about attribution science, and then get into the covered period and climate science before wrapping with a couple of small language suggestions. So just to very briefly summarize, you heard this last week, but it is very central to the bill, so I wanted to touch on it. In the treasurer's report, that's really attribution science that you heard about from Professor Mencken from Dartmouth. He testified using peer-reviewed consensus scientific methods. Scientists can quantify the economic losses a region like Vermont has endured from the impacts of global warming to date, trace those losses back to particular emitters, and provide estimates of future losses. So again, as you've heard from the treasurer, this is very doable work. Similarly, you heard from Rick Keaty in terms of the work that ANR would be tasked with in determining proportional liability amongst the parties. He made very clear in his testimony to you and to the Senate that when looking at the emissions from historic fossil fuel extraction, data from the SEC and other publicly available filings make that work and that math very doable. Shifting to the covered period, just a very brief history in this bill before I get to history in the more general sense of the word. The bill started with a covered period of 2000 to 2020, to the beginning of 2020, rather. That was expanded at Agency of Natural Resources request and Senate Judiciary to 1995 to the end of this year. So a 30-year period rather than a 20-year period. And so I wanted to describe some of the events leading up to 1995. The particular event in 1995, that was the stated rationale in Senate Judiciary, that was the first conference of the parties, the first of the international negotiations on the climate crisis that have been going on every year since then. But there was a lot leading up to that. So I have a sort of non-exhaustive list that I want to just very quickly tick through. But at a high level, these events make abundantly clear that major fossil fuel companies classified as responsible parties under S259 had a reasonable basis to anticipate the possibility of future regulation of their products and activities. As you've heard, these companies were well aware of the damage their products and activities had caused and were causing to the world's climate, the impacts that global warming would have, and the costs to third parties that it would create. When coupled with the national and international attention to and activity around climate change throughout the late 80s and early 90s, by at least as early as 1995, these corporations could have reasonably anticipated future regulations of their products and activities, including potential liability for the damage resulting from their products and activities. So very briefly, and there was a lot going on during this period, I'm leaving a lot out, but in 1988, NASA's James Hansen, among others, testified before the US Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee about the expected impacts of climate change, and the link to fossil fuels was very, very clear in that hearing. Also in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, held its first session, and was endorsed by the UN General Assembly. In 1989, the EPA published a report titled Policy Options for Stabilizing Global Climate, which was requested by Congress earlier in the 80s, and alongside a second report that was requested on the potential effects of global climate change on the United States, which was published in 1990. Also in 1990, the IPCC issued its first assessment report, and then a subsequent expansion of that report in 1992, which also confirmed that fossil fuels are a central, probably the central contributor to climate change, and that the greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels was growing at that time. Last couple of items I'll highlight here. In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. By June of 1993, it had 166 signatories, and the US Senate ratified it on October 10th of 1992. And then in 1995, the first conference of the parties was held in Berlin, and the IPCC published its second assessment report. The last thing I want to get into before those brief language suggestions are climate science and the expected impacts on Vermont from climate change. So I want to delve briefly into what climate science indicates is coming at Vermont in the years and decades to come. I've submitted to your committee a number of documents, all of them dozens or hundreds of pages long. So obviously I will only quote very briefly from them. But these are documents that really represent an enormous body of work by scientists around the state and the country on these impacts, and are certainly worthy of your consideration as you look at this bill. So just one or two brief pull quotes from each of the documents I submitted. The Northeast chapter on the fourth climate assessment from 2018. This is the US National Climate Assessment, the relevant chapter for Vermont. Projected increases in temperature are expected to lead to substantially more premature deaths, hospital admissions, and emergency department visits due to heat across the Northeast. The Northeast chapter of the fifth climate assessment that was published last year stated that precipitation in the Northeast has increased in all seasons, and extreme precipitation events, which are defined as events with the top 1% of daily precipitation accumulations, have increased by about 60% in the region. That's the largest increase in the United States. NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, Vermont State Climate Summary states extreme weather events, particularly floods and severe storms, are having a stronger impact on Vermont. I don't think you need that report to tell you that, but that is certainly what the science shows as well. To continue the quote, at the same time, multi-year meteorological and hydrological droughts continue to pose challenges for water-dependent sectors. Extreme rainfall events are projected to become more frequent and intense in the future. And last, but certainly not least, the Vermont Climate Assessment states that Vermont's climate is projected to warm faster than the global average. And as ice and snow melt earlier in the spring, longer and warmer summers could lead to more evaporation, which could favor more frequent summer droughts. And the Northeast is also expected to experience more frequent and powerful storms. And lastly, factors like wetter winters and springs, a faster spring thaw, and more intense rainfall could contribute to an increased flooding across Vermont, which again, I don't think we necessarily needed a report to tell us, but certainly is what the science suggests is going to happen more in the future as well. Okay, lastly, two suggestions in terms of language. One, I wanted to note that what you heard from Ledge Council last Thursday morning on the savings clause, which is 598J, page 10, line 6 to 8, and then also bring to your attention some additional small additional changes that were proposed for that subsection by an attorney who testified to House Judiciary that afternoon that you haven't heard. So this is the what's called the savings clause. It's essentially the sentence that says, and I will actually read it, but in layperson's terms, essentially, if there are other legal remedies available, those don't go away just because this bill passes. So as in the bill you have, that reads, nothing in this section shall be construed to supersede or diminish in any way existing remedies available to a person of the state at common law or under statute. During the joint hearing, Michael O'Grady suggested replacing the phrase person of the state just with the word person, which is defined in 1 VSA section 128 very broadly. It is a very, very broad definition. I've included it in my testimony, but won't read it here. So the other testimony that happened on this savings clause was that afternoon again in Judiciary, so you didn't hear it. Jeff Hand, who is an attorney who BPIRG has consulted with on this policy, just for full disclosure, suggested expanding on Michael O'Grady's suggestion by adding an explicit cross-reference to 1 VSA section 128, just for clarity, and by replacing the phrase existing remedies with the phrase any other remedies. And so that would then read, nothing in the section shall be construed to supersede or diminish in any way any other remedies available to a person as defined at 1 VSA section 128 at common law or under statute. That change, in particular, the one, well, both of them are very important. The one you didn't hear about from Ledge Council, we see as important because rather than sort of time bounding how this works and only covering existing remedies, it would change that to any other remedy, which just makes it broader and clearer that if there's a legitimate reason under common law or statute for a fossil fuel company covered by this to also be held accountable in some other way in the court system, this law doesn't get in the way of that. So we support those two edits, because they bring that additional breadth and clarity. And then the other one, I have not included this in my written testimony yet, though I can add a little bit to it and resubmit it. In the current bill, see, I have a page number here. There is language that allows the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, this is the bottom of page 8, state line 16 to 20, 2C. This is the section that says they can basically pay an installment plan instead of all at once. And it allows the Secretary at the Secretary's discretion to adjust those payments, the future payments for the CPI, adjust them for inflation. That makes sense. We would suggest also allowing the Secretary to have discretion to charge interest on those payments, since obviously if they're not paying that money all at once, there's a financial benefit that those companies accrue to delaying their payments to Vermont, and Vermont should be able to charge reasonable interest on it. That is my testimony. Thank you so much. I know that took a little while, but that's a lot of important things to cover. Mostly, I wanted to say deep appreciation for this committee and all of its works on both sides of the climate ledger, both reducing pollution and all of the many things you're doing in climate resilience, including, but by no way limited to this bill. And I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Pat.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very sorry I had to miss all the testimony last Thursday. So if some of this was answered, just cut me off. But in terms of the entities that are responsible and that will be paying this cost, that is based on their sale of fossil fuels in Vermont? Or
No, it's essentially goes as far upstream as you can, which is, as I understand, it's a common practice in the sort of polluter pay area. I'm looking for the specific definition here. So covered greenhouse gas emissions is, of course, during the covered period, there's a separate definition there in that 30-year period. But it's resulting from the use of fossil fuels extracted or refined by an entity. And so you're talking about, and I'll add a little bit that might also be on your mind, companies, the threshold being companies that during that 30-year period extracted or refined fossil fuels that emitted in terms of, or responsible for the emissions in terms of CO2 equivalent, 1 billion metric tons or more from that 30-year period. You got testimony last week on the number of entities that would cover, but we're talking about the companies that are actually pulling it out of the ground, not the companies that are sort of further down the supply chain.
Okay, so therefore, thank you. A large multinational fossil fuel company, their emissions are global, and so then there's a determination of what their obligation might be in Vermont as opposed to any other place.
Well, it's essentially based on, I mean, you look at climate science, obviously the damage being caused to Vermont is from total global emissions. And so this bill takes that big number, which is all emissions of any kind, and then sort of zooms into emissions from fossil fuel extraction and refinement, which is very broadly about 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that is really what is causing the damage to Vermont. And so, as I laid out, the bill sets in motion a process where ANR would ultimately figure out company X, what percentage of total global fossil fuel related emissions of greenhouse gases from that 30-year period were you responsible for in terms of your extraction and refining? And then whatever that percentage is, that company would have a cost recovery demand that is that percentage of the treasurer's cost estimate to the state of Vermont.
I'm asking because I've always been very, I think you may know, very conscious of the fact that the emissions are global and do not respect the boundary between New Hampshire and Vermont or wherever. So
yes,
okay, thanks.
That is very true, and that's very much embedded in the structure this bill sets in place.
Thank you. Representative Smith.
Thank you. Are the New England states doing this as well? The other New England states or New York?
There are bills that have been submitted on this in Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, and I believe now California. And we've heard of one or two other states that are getting close. New York passed it through its state Senate last year, but I wouldn't want to speculate on how close any of those other states are to passing it.
Do you think it would be best if New England combined into one major, call it a solid or whatever you want to call it on the fossil fuel companies?
Would it be best? Sure. I'd love the whole globe to do this all at once, but we can't control what other jurisdictions are doing, and the costs to Vermonters right now are so significant that from BPER's standpoint, we have no interest in waiting for the other New England states to get around to do this. The sooner we do this, the sooner we can fund and make the resilience investments that are contemplated in this bill. And frankly, the sooner we make those investments, the more we're going to reduce Vermonters' costs over the long term. If we're not making them until the 2030s, there's a lot of costs that could potentially happen between now and then. So time is of the essence from our perspective.
It concerns me, I don't know where to start with this. I could go back 100 years, but fossil fuel, and I realize in your report here, you indicated that they were aware of global warming happening years in the future, which is now. But all of the fossil fuel that's been burned up has helped this country grow to what it is or was. Shipping lines, airlines, there's some big polluters right there. Especially shipping in the oceans and the airlines in the skies. Why aren't we pursuing something like that rather than just go after the companies that help make these other companies multi-millionaire, multi-billionaire rich?
I guess my answer to that would be, in one, agreement. Yes, obviously these products had a value to the U.S. and international economy, but ultimately the companies that extracted and refined these fuels were paid a market value for that and made a profit on it. But that cost did not account for the damage those fuels were causing. And so from our perspective, with these companies that have made and are continuing to make just unimaginable profits and are being fairly compensated for the products and services that they are offering, it is appropriate for Vermont to recover some of those profits to compensate for the costs to Vermont from the climate crisis and the greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuels that caused it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ben, can you say one more time the other states? Mass, New York, Maryland, and California?
Yes.
Representative Von Bertz.
Ben, what was the rationale for allowing the companies to pay in installments? Because they're going to do that. And therefore, it seems to me, I don't know, gives more opportunity for mischief. And so, so on the one hand, if we're going to do it, by the way, I definitely agree that we should be charging interest. On the other, I just wonder why we did it. It's there for a reason.
I am not aware of any legal rationale for that. I guess what I would say is, the two sort of most prominent precursors to this in proposed legislation are the New York bill, which was introduced 1 or 2 years ago. It has that concept in it. And then before that, actually, which I think many members of the committee are aware of, Senator Sanders and Senator Van Hollen proposed as part of the Build Back Better bill, which never ultimately was passed, an amendment that would have had $50 billion nationally a year coming from the fossil fuel industry in a very similar construct for 10 years. And so I think ultimately that's where it flowed from. I absolutely agree with you that there's a reasonable policy discussion to be had in terms of, is that wise or not? But that, I think, was sort of the origin of it.
And have we had testimony somewhere along the line, Attorney General's office, about ability to defend what is obviously going to come after we send the bill?
Yes, Senate Judiciary took testimony from the Attorney General. She indicated that her office could defend it, that she agreed with the legal analysis that other witnesses had offered, though she didn't want to opine on the AG's specific opinion on the legal questions at play, so as to not show our cards, obviously, and said that she would be proud to defend it. I believe, well, actually, I know that last Thursday afternoon, House Judiciary had her on the schedule, and I think they just ran long and she wasn't able to testify, but I believe they are planning on taking testimony in House Judiciary from the Attorney General.
There are questions? Not seeing any. Thanks for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next, we will go to Andy Jones joining us via Zoom.
Hello. Everybody hear me okay?
Ken.
Thank you. thank you for the opportunity to testify on Senate Bill 259 relating to climate change recovery. My name is Andy Jones. I am the farm manager at Intervale Community Farm in Burlington, and I'm going to talk today sort of at the micro level of impact, as opposed to the high level broad scale stuff that Ben was just addressing. Many of the things that he highlighted, we have recent real world examples. Intervale Community Farm grows about 22 acres of mixed vegetables in Burlington. Started in 1990, we're one of 6 independently owned and operated farms leasing land from the nonprofit Intervale Center. Peak season, we employ about 14 people growing and selling vegetables from arugula to zucchini for 11 months of the year. I have managed Intervale Community Farm since 1994. I'm the past president and a board member of the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont, NOFA Vermont, and a past president and current board treasurer of the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, VBBGA. These comments represent only my personal opinion. The entirety of our farm, as well as those of our neighbors, lies within the 100-year floodplain of the Winooski River. We expect floods, and we have managed around them for decades, but the magnitude of the floods are changing. On July 12th, 2023, 99% of Intervale Community Farm and all of our farm neighbors were flooded, wiping out approximately $200,000 worth of our crops and around $500,000 of our neighbors' crops. The Agency of Agriculture received reports of losses on 264 farms from around the state of all types, covering 27,000 acres and tallying around $16 million, which represents an average annual loss of annual farm income by about 28%. There's good reason to believe that the agency's figure is an underestimate, as it relies primarily on self-reported data. If it's all right, I'm going to share my screen and show a couple of photos. All right, everybody see that's half of our farm before peak flood on July 12th. Or actually this is the afternoon of July 11th, taken by UVM remote sensing group. Prior to this, Tropical Storm Irene had been our high watermark, hugely exceeding 20 years of prior flooding at that point and covering about 97% of our farm. After Irene, I contacted the Burlington National Weather Service office, which estimated that Irene was likely to have been probably a 50 to 75-year flood at our location, or put another way, a flood that we had an annual recurrence likelihood of 1.5 or 2%. Maybe they were wrong, or we're just unlucky that 2023 came only 12 years later. But the evidence really points to climate change. Second photo here is a composite satellite image that the state assembled after the floods. This is at peak flood, so the areas over on the left side of the road here are the ones in the prior photo, and over here are our greenhouse complex and those of our neighbors. There's one little postage stamp area here that didn't flood, but that's about it for the entire valley. Like many in Vermont, we learned from and changed after Irene. We altered our crop mixes, moved to more raised beds, planted to optimize small variations in topography. We elevated electrical services and HVAC mechanicals above the 100-year flood level. We selected the very highest sites for our greenhouses and structures, chose flood resilient building materials, and the list goes on. These measures reduced our infrastructure and crop losses from the 2023 flood, but they came at a cost. Of the nearly $500,000 we've spent on infrastructure since 2011, around 100,000 of that is money we might not have spent had the increased threat presented by climate change been absent. With annual sales of $750,000 or $800,000 and annual capital expenses averaging $30,000 to $40,000, $100,000 is real money for a farm our size. Final slide, sort of what it looks like on the ground. This is our summer farm stand distribution area and some of our tunnels. This is close to peak flood on Wednesday, July 12th. Floods are the most damaging of the threats presented by the warming climate, but others are consequential as well. As Ben noted, rainfall exceeding 2 inches per storm has increased dramatically since 1990. Even without floods, that much rain makes it nearly impossible to get equipment into the field to plant, weed, harvest. It stalls growth and it pushes plant diseases off the charts. We're seeing lots of novel diseases that we hadn't seen before due to warmer, wetter conditions. While too much rain is a problem, we also face increasingly frequent droughts. The 5 lowest measured water levels on the lower Winooski River date from 2009 to now. While many vegetable farmers outside of the Champlain and Connecticut valleys had little need for irrigation throughout the 20th century, it is now nearly a requirement throughout the state. At Intervale Community Farm, we depend on irrigation every year. Money alone will not solve climate change, but it can help to blunt the worst effects. We have more electrical systems. We should elevate greenhouses. We should relocate to higher areas, and irrigation investments it would be wise to make. But we also need to replace 2 40-year-old tractors, expand a cooler, and pay our workers more so they can afford to live in or near Burlington. In the aftermath of flooding, we destroy any edible crops touched by floodwaters. We also test our soil after major floods like Irene and 2023 in order to make sure that heavy metals, hydrocarbon compounds, and microbes will not present a risk in future crops. Though the long-term risks presented by floodwaters are very low, we are careful and cautious because we do not want to cause harm. Furthermore, if our vegetables did make someone sick, I have no doubt that Intervale Community Farm would be financially accountable through our insurance and likely the legal system as well. The tobacco industry knew the risks of smoking. The pharmaceutical industry knew the risks presented by opioids. The chemical industry recognized the damages from PFAS and PCBs, among others, and they have, to a small degree, been forced to contribute towards fixing some of what their denials and actions wrought. The oil companies knew decades ago the central role their products played in changing the climate. They can and should help shoulder the cost of fixing the problems they have exacerbated through their deception. Farmers and communities around the state would benefit from funding to move assets out of harm's way, relocate to higher ground, install irrigation systems, and many other capital improvements, as well as from large-scale rapid response funding that could help farmers purchase feed for their livestock, make payroll to keep employees, and stabilize cash flow in the face of major losses. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important bill.
Thank you for your testimony. Yeah, would you be able to submit it in writing for us?
Surely.
That would be great. And the pictures as well would be good for us to have.
Happy to do that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Do members have questions? I guess I'm curious how your soils do test after the floods, and what do you do if have you found I mean, I hate to say the word, but
It's a huge question. We've had, the public that we sell to has, UVM Extension has been a great partner in this, following Tropical Storm Irene and this year. So yeah, we're looking, basically there's sort of three buckets of things that we're doing broad scale or working with Extension to have them do broad scale testing, on our farm and other farms around the state. And they're looking primarily, the longer term threats are heavy metals, because once they're there, they don't really go anywhere. Heavy metal testings, basically all the heavy metal testing has returned nothing different than normal Vermont background levels, following both floods. Even after Irene, when we were sort of scraping up the silt deposited layers specifically that came from the flood, we weren't finding anything unusual. Broad spectrum hydrocarbons, looking at a variety of different compounds. Those are sort of can be long-term, can be short-term, intermediate. A lot of them will volatilize over time. Again, those are the same story as the heavy metals, in that we're not really finding anything significant. And then the third bucket is potential microbial threats. Looking at generic E. coli, which is considered a good proxy, excuse me, for pathogenic E. coli and other possible pathogens, and typically have high numbers right after the flood. But due to the fact that those organisms are not actually native soil-borne organisms, the populations of those decline rapidly, so that, even within weeks or sometimes months, those levels will be down to sort of safe, normal background levels that you would see from on any farm and any soil in the state. So that's kind of been our testing protocol, working with Extension, and they're looking at our stuff and places around the state.
and have you been able to access any funds to help you in the post-recovery from Irene or the most recent flooding, like the business funds available?
We sell everything through a community supported agriculture or CSA type arrangement, where people join for a season of produce, either summer or winter. And so we actually had a very successful GoFundMe campaign that there was a lot of participation by those folks who are our existing members. We have 650 or 700 households between the summer and the winter, so it's a lot of folks. So we didn't actually take advantage of the state or most of the private funding because we did so well. But we're in a fortunate position. We have a long time committed base of people to go right to. We are in a situation where we have some kind of self-insurance plan through that mechanism of shared risk through the CSA. We have some experience, so we knew where we could we knew what we could cut, what we could avoid spending money on, how to get through, based on our experience last time around with Irene in 2011.
Representative Bongard.
I think you said this at the beginning, but just say it again for us. How would you quantify the damage from last July? You had the crop loss, you said, I forgot the number you said, but you also had undoubtedly damage to buildings, to your structures, and did you put all those together into a?
Limited. We had a little bit of one structure, but like the photos I was showing, a lot of the buildings that we have are flow through. And that was one of the things that we started doing in the
So it was more labor then, because you had to clean out silt people from those, I would guess. I think you froze.
And crop loss.
Yeah, the crop loss was the major thing. It was about $200,000 in crops, but the physical infrastructure damage was limited. There was a lot of labor. The cleanup was extensive. But, you know, compared to most places, a farm is somewhat self-cleaning and our buildings are flood resilient. And we've been building that way for a long time with the knowledge that we're in a floodplain and we're gonna have floods.
Knowledge that you're in a floodplain. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
We'll take a 5-minute break and then hear from Lauren Hurl.